The morning sun cast long shadows across the Denver International Airport as thousands of travelers moved through the bustling terminals like water flowing through carefully designed channels. Monica Hayes walked among them with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades navigating crowded spaces while maintaining complete awareness of her surroundings. She wore simple jeans and a comfortable navy blue sweater, with her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she was one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the United States. That was exactly how she wanted it. At 42 years old, Monica had risen through the ranks of the Federal Bureau of Investigation with a combination of brilliant investigative work, unshakable integrity, and a refusal to let anyone diminish her capabilities because of her race or gender. She had spent 20 years proving herself in a system that often seemed designed to hold her back. 3 months ago, the president had appointed her as the director of the FBI, making her the first African-American woman to hold the position. The announcement had dominated news cycles for weeks, but Monica had immediately focused on the work rather than the historic nature of her appointment. Today, she was flying back to Washington after a quiet weekend visiting her mother in Colorado. Monica had deliberately chosen to travel without her usual security detail. She believed that leaders who never experienced what ordinary citizens faced every day lost touch with reality. Her security team had protested, but she had overruled them. She wanted to move through the airport like any other traveler, to see what they saw and feel what they felt. Kyle Murphy stood near the security checkpoint in Terminal B, his eyes scanning the crowd with the mechanical precision of someone who had performed the same task thousands of times. He was 38 years old with thinning brown hair and a face that had once been handsome, but now showed the wear of too many late nights and too much stress. He wore the uniform of a Transportation Security Administration officer with practiced authority. 12 years he had worked at this airport, and for most of that time he had been a decent officer who took his job seriously. But things had changed over the past 18 months. It started with football bets that seemed like harmless fun. Kyle had always enjoyed watching games, and putting a little money down made them more exciting. Then the bets got bigger and the losses piled up faster than he could manage. Before he knew what was happening, he owed $40,000 to people who did not accept excuses or payment plans. They wanted their money, and they wanted it now. That was when Victor approached him. Kyle never learned Victor's last name and suspected Victor was not even his real first name. Victor had somehow known about the gambling debts, about the second mortgage Kyle had taken on his house, about the fights with his wife about money. Victor had made a simple proposal. All Kyle had to do was create distractions. When Victor sent him a text message, Kyle would select a random traveler and plant a small package of drugs in their luggage. The resulting arrest and investigation would tie up security resources for hours, while Victor's real shipments moved through other checkpoints unnoticed. $5,000 per successful plant. No questions asked. Kyle had refused at first. He was a law enforcement officer, not a criminal. But Victor had explained in very clear terms what would happen if the gambling debts were not paid. Kyle had seen enough crime scene photos in his career to know that these were not idle threats. He had a wife and 2 kids. What choice did he have? That was what he told himself anyway. The first time had been terrifying. His hands shook so badly he almost dropped the package. But the arrest went smoothly and $5,000 appeared in his bank account the next day. The second time was easier. By the 10th time, it felt almost routine. Monica placed her carry-on bag on the conveyor belt and walked through the metal detector without incident. She collected her bag on the other side and started to move toward her gate. Her flight was not for another 90 minutes, but she preferred to arrive early and review briefing documents on her tablet while she waited. Being director meant the work never really stopped, even on weekends. Kyle's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out casually and glanced at the screen. A text message from Victor with a single photo attached and 5 words. 10 minutes, Terminal B, high value. Kyle's stomach tightened. High value meant a particularly important shipment was coming through, which meant they needed a particularly disruptive distraction. He scanned the crowd moving through the checkpoint looking for the right target. His eyes landed on Monica as she walked past with her carry-on bag. A black woman traveling alone, well-dressed but not flashy. Probably professional but not rich enough to hire expensive lawyers immediately. Perfect. Kyle had learned to profile potential victims carefully. You wanted someone who would seem plausible as a drug carrier, but who did not have the immediate resources to fight back effectively. Someone the system would believe guilty until proven innocent rather than the other way around. Kyle called out in his most authoritative voice. The woman turned and looked at him with calm, steady eyes. He motioned her over for a secondary screening. His partner, Linda Yang, a newer recruit who had only been working at the airport for 4 months, looked confused but followed his lead. Kyle had made sure to request Linda as his partner for this shift. She was green enough that she would not question his procedures and eager enough to please that she would back up whatever he said. Monica walked back to the checkpoint without protest. She had been through enough airports in her career to know that arguing with security officers never improved the situation, but something about this particular officer bothered her. She had spent 20 years reading people, learning to spot the tiny signals that separated honest citizens from criminals, and this officer's body language was wrong. His eyes moved too quickly, darting between her and the terminal entrance. His smile was too practiced, too rehearsive. His hands moved with the confidence of someone who had done this exact thing many times before. Kyle began the secondary screening with well-rehearsed patter about random selections and routine procedures. Linda stood nearby, trying to look professional while mostly just feeling awkward. Kyle opened Monica's carry-on bag and began removing items one by one, making a show of examining each piece carefully. His hands moved smoothly, years of practice making the movements look natural. Monica watched his every move with the trained observation of a federal investigator, and that was when she saw it. A fraction of a second when his right hand dipped into his pocket and emerged with something small, then slipped that something into the side pocket of her bag. It happened so fast that anyone not watching closely would have missed it completely. Monica's expression did not change, but her mind began working through the implications immediately. This was not random. This was not profiling. This was deliberate criminal activity. The officer was planting evidence. The question was why and who else was involved. She remained perfectly still and waited to see what would happen next. Kyle's fingers continued their practice search through Monica's carry-on bag, while he maintained a steady stream of casual conversation designed to put travelers at ease while he worked. He asked about her destination and the purpose of her trip in that friendly but official tone that security officers develop over years of repetition. Monica answered his questions with polite brevity, giving him no reason to suspect that she had seen exactly what he had done. Her training had taught her that the best way to catch criminals in the act was to let them believe they had succeeded. Linda Yang stood a few feet away, dividing her attention between Kyle's screening and the flow of other passengers through the checkpoint. A businessman was having trouble removing his laptop from its bag and kept setting off the metal detector. Linda moved to help him, leaving Kyle and Monica essentially alone for those crucial seconds. Kyle had timed it perfectly. He always did. Kyle's hand moved to the side pocket of the carry-on bag, the same pocket where he had just planted the small package wrapped in plastic. His face transformed into an expression of surprise and concern that he had practiced in the mirror at home. He pulled out the package slowly, holding it up so that Linda and the nearby security cameras would have a clear view. The package was small, about the size of a deck of cards, filled with white powder that anyone in law enforcement would immediately recognize as cocaine. Monica watched the performance with professional detachment. She had seen countless criminals over her career, from street-level dealers to sophisticated white-collar fraudsters, and they all shared certain characteristics when they thought they were getting away with something. Kyle had that look now, that small spark of triumph in his eyes that he tried to hide behind his mask of official concern. He was proud of himself. He thought he had pulled it off again. Kyle's voice changed, becoming harder and more formal. He called out to Linda that he had found something. Linda turned away from the businessman and hurried back over, her young face showing genuine shock when she saw the package in Kyle's hand. Other security officers began moving toward them. Within seconds, Monica was surrounded by 5 TSA officers, all of them looking at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. Monica remained completely calm. She had faced down armed suspects, corrupt politicians, and hostile congressional committees. A group of airport security officers did not intimidate her in the slightest. She spoke in a level, measured tone and asked Kyle to explain exactly where he claimed to have found the package. Kyle repeated his story about discovering it in the side pocket during a routine secondary screening. His voice was confident. He had told this lie many times before and no one had ever questioned it. Linda watched the scene unfold with growing unease. Something felt wrong about the whole situation. She had been working with Kyle for 3 months now and had noticed certain patterns. He always seemed to know which travelers to select for secondary screening. His searches always seemed to find something when they needed to find something, and the travelers he selected always fit certain profiles. She had pushed these observations to the back of her mind, telling herself that Kyle was just experienced and good at his job. But now, watching this composed woman who showed no signs of guilt or panic, Linda began to wonder if her instincts had been trying to tell her something important. Kyle began the formal arrest procedure. He asked Monica for her identification and travel documents. She reached into her purse with slow, deliberate movements and pulled out her wallet. She removed her driver's license and handed it to him. Kyle glanced at it briefly, noting the name Monica Hayes and a Colorado address. Nothing unusual. Then Monica pulled out a second form of identification and handed it to Kyle without comment. Kyle looked down at the leather credential case in his hand and felt his blood turn to ice. The identification card showed the same woman's face from the driver's license, but the text next to the photo made his vision swim. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Director Monica Hayes. The official seal of the FBI gleamed in the overhead lights. His hands began to shake. Monica watched the color drain from Kyle's face with cold satisfaction. She had considered identifying herself immediately, but she wanted to see how far he would take the performance. How she knew for certain that this was a deliberate plant, not a case of mistaken identity or contaminated luggage. The officer had known exactly what he was doing. She spoke clearly and loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. She stated her name and title, and informed Kyle that he had just planted evidence on a federal law enforcement officer. She demanded to speak with his supervisor immediately. Kyle's mind raced through a dozen different scenarios, none of them good. If this woman truly was the FBI director, his career was over. But worse than that, if she was the director, she would investigate. And if she investigated, she would find everything. The payments from Victor, the other plants, the whole operation. He would go to prison for years. His wife would leave him. His kids would grow up knowing their father was a corrupt cop who had framed innocent people. Everything was falling apart. Linda stepped forward and took the FBI credentials from Kyle's shaking hands. She had pulled out her phone and was looking at the FBI website, comparing the photo on the official page to the woman standing in front of them. The photos matched perfectly. There was even a recent news article about Director Hayes visiting field offices across the western states. Linda's voice was barely above a whisper when she told Kyle that the credentials appeared to be genuine. Kyle made a decision born of desperation rather than logic. He insisted loudly that the credentials must be fake. Criminals used fake badges all the time to avoid arrest. He had found drugs in this woman's bag during a legitimate search, and he was going to process her arrest according to proper procedures. His voice was too loud, too insistent, and everyone nearby could hear the edge of panic in it. Monica had seen this reaction before from suspects who realized they had been caught. Some people became violent, some became cooperative, and some doubled down on their lies in the desperate hope that repetition would somehow make the lies true. Kyle was clearly in the third category. She pulled out her phone and made a call. When someone answered on the other end, she identified herself and requested immediate assistance from the Denver FBI field office. She gave her location and a brief description of the situation. The person on the other end confirmed that agents would arrive within 20 minutes. Other travelers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Some were recording video on their phones. A TSA supervisor named Alan Price pushed through the small crowd that had gathered. He was a stern-looking man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. Linda quickly explained the situation to him in a low voice. Alan took the FBI credentials from her hand and examined them carefully. He had worked in airport security for 30 years and had seen plenty of fake badges. These credentials looked completely authentic. Alan made a command decision. He ordered the area cleared of non-essential personnel and asked Monica politely if she would be willing to wait in a secure office until FBI agents arrived to verify her identity. Monica agreed immediately. She wanted everything documented properly. This was not just about her anymore. If this officer was planting evidence on travelers, he had likely done it before. Every arrest he had made was now suspect. Every person he had accused deserved to have their case reviewed. Kyle stood frozen as Alan took control of the situation. His partner was escorting the FBI director to a secure office. Other officers were preserving the scene and collecting evidence. Someone was probably already pulling security camera footage. It was all over. He had planted drugs on the one person in the entire airport who had both the authority and the resources to destroy him completely. The mathematical improbability of it made him want to laugh, but he knew if he started laughing he would not be able to stop. Alan turned to Kyle and spoke in a voice that carried unmistakable authority. Kyle was relieved of duty immediately pending investigation. He was to surrender his security badge and remain in the office until further notice. He was not to speak with any other officers about the incident. Alan's expression made it clear that he already suspected what had happened, and that Kyle's career in law enforcement was finished whether the woman was really the FBI director or not. Monica sat in the secure office and began making additional phone calls. She contacted her deputy director in Washington and briefed him on the situation. She called the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility and requested a full investigation team. She called the Department of Justice and informed them that a federal officer had been targeted by what appeared to be a corrupt TSA employee. With each call, the machinery of federal law enforcement began to turn, slowly at first but with gathering momentum. Kyle sat in a different office down the hall, alone with his thoughts and his terror. He kept replaying the moment when he had selected that woman from the crowd. What were the odds? What cosmic joke had placed the FBI director in his terminal on his shift during one of Victor's operations? He thought about running, but where would he go? He thought about calling a lawyer. Monica established a command center in a conference room that Alan Price had cleared for FBI use. Within 2 hours, the room had been transformed into an active operations hub with laptop computers, secure phone lines, and whiteboards covered in notes and timelines. Carmen's team from the Denver field office worked alongside agents who had arrived from FBI headquarters in Washington. The investigation was expanding rapidly as each new piece of information revealed additional layers of the conspiracy. The financial analysis team had traced the shell companies that paid Kyle Murphy back through several layers of corporate structures. The trail led to a network of businesses registered in states with loose incorporation requirements, all of them appearing legitimate on the surface, but actually controlled by a sophisticated criminal organization. The team was still working on identifying the ultimate beneficiaries, but the complexity of the structure suggested serious money and serious criminals. Linda Yang sat in a small office providing her statement to 2 FBI agents. She was nervous and kept apologizing for not seeing what Kyle had been doing sooner. The agents assured her that she was not under suspicion and that her cooperation was valuable. Linda described the past 3 months working with Kyle, recounting specific incidents that had seemed strange at the time, but which she had dismissed. There was the businessman who had sworn repeatedly that the drugs in his briefcase had been planted. There was the young mother traveling with 2 small children who had become hysterical during her arrest. There was the elderly veteran who had maintained his innocence with such quiet dignity that even the arresting officers had seemed uncomfortable. Monica reviewed Linda's statement with growing certainty that the number of victims was going to be higher than Kyle had admitted. Criminals who confessed rarely told the complete truth on the first interview. They minimized their involvement, forgot convenient details, and tried to paint themselves in the best possible light. Kyle had admitted to 17 plants over 18 months, but the pattern of arrests suggested the real number might be closer to 30 or 40. The security footage review was revealing additional information. The technical team had pulled recordings from the past year and was using facial recognition software to track Kyle's movements throughout the terminal. They found dozens of instances where Kyle had intercepted travelers, performed secondary screenings, and made arrests. In many cases, the camera angles did not clearly capture the moment of planting, but the pattern of behavior was consistent. Kyle would call someone over, position his body to block the camera's view during the crucial seconds, and then discover drugs in a location he had just searched. Carmen briefed Monica on the progress every hour. The investigation had identified 12 definite cases where Kyle had likely planted evidence based on security footage and arrest records. Another 23 cases were suspicious but lacked clear video evidence of the plant. All 35 cases were being flagged for immediate review by the Department of Justice. Carmen had also reached out to the public, defender's office, and several private criminal defense attorneys who had represented people arrested by Kyle. They were gathering case files and client contact information. Monica's phone rang constantly with calls from Washington. The White House wanted updates. Congressional leaders wanted briefings. The media pressure was intense. A reporter from a major news network had somehow obtained information that the FBI director had been targeted at an airport and was now leading an investigation into TSA corruption. The story was spreading across social media and cable news. Monica authorized a brief press statement confirming that she had been involved in an incident at Denver International Airport and that a federal investigation was underway. She refused to provide additional details while the investigation was active. The Attorney General called personally to check on Monica and to discuss the legal implications of the case. The conversation was frank and focused. If TSA officers had been systematically planting evidence on travelers for months or years, the scandal would damage public trust in airport security across the country. Every person who had been falsely accused deserved exoneration and compensation. The criminal prosecutions needed to be handled carefully to ensure that defense attorneys could not claim the cases were politically motivated because the FBI director had been personally targeted. Monica appreciated the Attorney General's concerns but made her position clear. Politics did not matter. Public perception did not matter. The only thing that mattered was getting justice for the victims and ensuring this never happened again. If that meant uncomfortable headlines and difficult congressional hearings, so be it. The Attorney General agreed and promised full support from the Department of Justice. By early evening, the FBI had obtained warrants for Kyle Murphy's home, phone records, and financial accounts. A search team executed the warrant at Kyle's house in a suburb south of Denver. His wife was home with their 2 children when the agents arrived. She was shocked and confused, insisting there must be some mistake. The agents were professional but thorough, searching every room and seizing computers, phones, documents, and anything else that might contain evidence. The search team found 2 burner phones hidden in Kyle's home office, along with handwritten notes that appeared to be records of payments received. There was also a ledger showing gambling debts and payment schedules. The evidence supported Kyle's confession and suggested his financial desperation had been even worse than he had admitted. One of the burner phones contained text messages from Victor with dates, times, and occasionally photos of specific travelers to target. Monica reviewed the text messages with particular interest. The photos that Victor had sent showed travelers who fit certain profiles: people traveling alone, minorities, people who appeared to be working class or middle class rather than wealthy. The targeting was deliberate and calculated to identify victims who would seem plausible as drug smugglers, but who would have limited resources to fight back effectively. It was profiling used as a weapon, exploiting existing biases within the criminal justice system. The technical team began analyzing the phone records and text messages to build a timeline of Victor's communications with Kyle. They identified approximately 30 text messages over 18 months, each one preceding an arrest by Kyle within a few hours. The correlation was damning, but the phone number Victor used was, as expected, a burner phone that had been used only for communications with Kyle and then destroyed. Tracing it back to a specific individual would be difficult. Carmen suggested a different approach. Instead of trying to trace Victor through the phones, they should look at the pattern of drug seizures at other airports. If this operation was active in Denver, it was probably active elsewhere. They could analyze TSA arrest records nationwide looking for officers with similar patterns: unusually high arrest rates, clustering of arrests around specific times, financial irregularities, and victims who consistently maintained their innocence. Monica authorized a nationwide data analysis. She contacted the heads of FBI field offices in 12 major cities and requested immediate reviews of TSA arrest records at their airports. She wanted reports within 72 hours on any officers who showed suspicious patterns. She also requested that the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees TSA, provide complete personnel and arrest records for the past 3 years at all major airports. The Department of Homeland Security was not happy about the request. There was institutional resistance to the idea that TSA officers might be systematically corrupt. The agency's leadership worried about the public relations damage and the impact on employee morale. But Monica was not requesting cooperation, she was demanding it. When the Homeland Security Secretary tried to push back, Monica escalated the issue directly to the president. An hour later, the secretary called back and agreed to provide full cooperation. As night fell over Denver, Monica finally took a break to eat something. She had been working for 12 hours straight since the incident at the checkpoint. Carmen ordered pizza for the team, and they ate while continuing to review evidence and plan next steps. The conference room had the focused energy of a major investigation in its early stages. When every new piece of information opens up additional questions and leads, one of the junior agents asked Monica how she had remained so calm during the arrest. Most people would have panicked or become angry, but she had stayed completely controlled and observant. Monica explained that emotional control was essential in law enforcement. If you let your emotions drive your decisions, you made mistakes. She had recognized immediately that this was not a random incident, and that staying calm would give her the best chance to observe and gather information. But privately, Monica acknowledged to herself that the experience had been deeply unsettling. She had spent her entire career working within the system of American justice, believing that despite its flaws, the system ultimately worked. To have an officer of that system deliberately attempt to frame her was a profound betrayal. It made her question how many other innocent people had been betrayed in the same way, people who did not have her resources or authority to fight back. Monica woke at 6 in the morning after only 4 hours of sleep, her mind already working through the investigation's next steps. She showered and dressed in fresh clothes that her assistant had arranged to be delivered to the hotel, then reviewed overnight reports on her secure tablet, while drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime last week. The FBI never stopped working even when the director tried to sleep. The overnight team had made significant progress. The nationwide analysis of TSA arrest records had identified 17 officers at 12 different airports who showed patterns similar to Kyle Murphy. These officers had unusually high arrest rates, predominantly targeted minority travelers, and had financial records showing unexplained income increases. The pattern was consistent enough that it could not be coincidence. Monica authorized immediate surveillance on all 17 officers while the legal team prepared warrant applications. Carmen arrived at the hotel at 7 to brief Monica on developments. The interrogation of Kyle Murphy had continued through the night with fresh agents rotating in every few hours. Kyle had provided additional details about how Victor had recruited him, describing their first meeting at a sports bar where Kyle had been watching a football game and drowning his sorrows about his gambling debts. Victor had seemed to know everything about Kyle's financial situation and had made the offer seem almost reasonable. Just create a distraction when needed. Nobody would get hurt. The drugs were fake anyway, just training aids. Kyle had known these were lies but had chosen to believe them because the alternative was facing his debts. The technical team had achieved a breakthrough overnight. By analyzing the metadata from the text messages Victor had sent Kyle, they had identified the physical locations where several of the messages originated. All of them came from the Denver area, suggesting Victor was local rather than operating remotely. More importantly, 2 of the messages had been sent from locations near a warehouse district in North Denver that was known to be controlled by drug trafficking organizations. Surveillance teams were being positioned around that area now. Monica authorized a full investigation of the warehouse district. She wanted surveillance footage from every camera in the area, license plate readers tracking every vehicle that came and went, and financial analysis of every business registered to addresses in that district. This was going to be a methodical, thorough investigation that followed every lead no matter where it went. The Department of Justice had assigned a team of prosecutors to work on the case. They were reviewing the evidence against Kyle Murphy and beginning to build cases against the other 17 TSA officers who had been identified. The legal issues were complex because they needed to ensure that the prosecutions were bulletproof, while also moving quickly to stop any ongoing operations. Defense attorneys would inevitably claim that the entire investigation was tainted by Monica's personal involvement, so every piece of evidence had to be documented with unusual care. Monica flew back to Washington that afternoon, but the investigation continued around the clock. She established a task force at FBI headquarters called Operation Clean Passage, dedicated solely to investigating corruption in airport security. The task force included agents from multiple field offices, analysts from the Financial Crimes Division, cybersecurity specialists, and liaison officers from the Department of Homeland Security. Despite their initial resistance, Homeland Security leadership now recognized the severity of the problem and was cooperating fully. The first priority was identifying and stopping any corrupt officers before they could plant more evidence. The 17 officers under investigation were quietly removed from screening duties and placed on administrative leave while their cases were examined. Monica knew this would cause disruption at the airports and probably alert the criminal organization that law enforcement was investigating, but protecting potential victims was more important than maintaining operational security. The financial investigation was revealing the scope of the operation's sophistication. The shell companies that had paid Kyle Murphy were part of a network of over 50 businesses, all registered in different states, all appearing legitimate on the surface. Money flowed through these companies in complex patterns designed to obscure its criminal origins. The FBI's financial analysts estimated that the organization had paid out over $2 million to corrupt TSA officers over the past 3 years. If each officer had planted evidence 30 times for $5,000 per plant, they were looking at hundreds of victims nationwide. Carmen called with urgent news from Denver. Surveillance teams watching the warehouse district had observed suspicious activity at a facility registered to one of the shell companies. Multiple vehicles had arrived at odd hours, people had been moving large boxes, and the level of security around the facility was far higher than would be normal for a legitimate warehouse. Carmen requested authorization for a search warrant. Monica told her to get the warrant and execute it immediately. The raid on the warehouse happened at 4 in the morning. 20 FBI agents in tactical gear hit the facility simultaneously from 3 entrances. Inside, they found exactly what they had hoped for: evidence of a major drug distribution operation. There were kilograms of cocaine and methamphetamine packaged for distribution, detailed ledgers showing shipment schedules and payment records, and most importantly, computers with communications between the organization's leadership and their corrupted TSA officers. Among the people arrested at the warehouse was a man who matched Kyle Murphy's description of Victor. His real name was Victor Ruiz, and he had an extensive criminal record, including prior convictions for drug trafficking and money laundering. Under interrogation, Victor initially refused to cooperate. But when shown the evidence seized from the warehouse, he began to understand that his situation was hopeless. His lawyer negotiated a cooperation agreement in exchange for a reduced sentence. Victor agreed to provide detailed information about the entire operation. Victor's debriefing took 3 days and filled hundreds of pages of transcripts. He described how the organization recruited TSA officers by identifying those with financial vulnerabilities through online gambling sites, loan applications, and social media. They would approach the targets carefully, building trust before making the recruitment pitch. The officers were told their job was simply to create distractions by planting small amounts of drugs on random travelers. The real shipments would move through other checkpoints while security was focused on processing the fake arrests. The organization had refined the system over years. They provided the officers with packages that looked like street drugs but were actually cut with inert substances, reducing the organization's losses if a package was seized. They used burner phones and encrypted communications to maintain operational security. They paid the officers through shell companies to make the payments look legitimate, and they specifically instructed the officers to target travelers who fit certain profiles, exploiting racial and economic biases to select victims who would be least able to fight back effectively. Monica listened to recordings of Victor's debriefing with cold fury. This was not just drug trafficking. This was a systematic exploitation of weaknesses in the American justice system, turning law enforcement officers into tools of criminal enterprise while destroying innocent lives. Every person who had been arrested deserved justice, and Monica was going to make sure they got it. The FBI began the process of identifying all the victims. Carmen's team in Denver had compiled a list of 38 people arrested by Kyle Murphy over the past 2 years. Similar lists were being compiled for the 17 other corrupt officers at other airports. The total number of victims appeared to be somewhere between 400 and 500 people. Each case would need to be reviewed individually, evidence examined, convictions overturned, and records cleared. Monica assigned a team of victim advocates to begin contacting the people who had been falsely accused. This was going to be difficult and emotional work. Many of the victims had suffered enormously. Some had gone to prison. Some had lost their jobs or their professional licenses. Some had been deported. Some had lost custody of their children. Simply telling them that the charges were false would not undo the damage. But it was the necessary first step toward making things right. The first person the team contacted was a woman named Patricia Santos, who had been arrested by Kyle Murphy 14 months earlier. Patricia was a 32-year-old nurse who had been traveling to visit her sister when Kyle planted cocaine in her bag. She had maintained her innocence throughout the legal proceedings, but had eventually taken a plea deal because she could not afford to keep fighting. She lost her nursing license and had been working as a grocery store cashier ever since, when FBI agents appeared at Patricia's apartment to tell her that she had been framed and that the charges were going to be dismissed. She did not believe them at first. She thought it was some kind of cruel joke. Only when they showed her the security footage of Kyle planting the drugs did she accept that it was real. Then she broke down crying, 18 months of stress and shame and anger pouring out. 3 weeks into Operation Clean Passage, the investigation had expanded far beyond what anyone initially anticipated. The information provided by Victor Ruiz and the evidence seized from the warehouse had revealed connections to a major, international drug trafficking organization with operations spanning from South America through Mexico and into the United States. The corruption of TSA officers was just one component of a sophisticated smuggling operation that moved millions of dollars worth of drugs through American airports every month. Monica convened a meeting of law enforcement leaders from multiple agencies at FBI headquarters, representatives from the Drug Enforcement Administration, Customs and Border Protection, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice filled a secure conference room. She briefed them on everything Operation Clean Passage had uncovered so far, using a detailed presentation with charts showing the flow of drugs and money, photographs of suspects, and timelines of operations. The DEA representatives were particularly interested because several of the names that had emerged from the investigation matched targets from their own ongoing investigations into Mexican cartels. The trafficking organization that had recruited Kyle Murphy and the other TSA officers was part of a larger cartel network that DEA had been tracking for years. The airport security corruption was apparently a relatively recent innovation that the cartel had developed to reduce interdiction rates at a critical vulnerability point in their distribution chain. A DEA supervisor named Paul Graham explained the cartel's typical methods. They would move shipments through airports using sophisticated concealment techniques. Drugs hidden in luggage linings, swallowed in pellets disguised as legitimate products, or carried by unwitting couriers who did not know they were transporting contraband. Airport security was their biggest risk point, because TSA screening could detect many of these techniques. So the cartel had developed a counter-strategy: corrupt TSA officers to create chaos during screening that would allow the real shipments to pass through undetected. Monica asked how widespread this tactic might be. Beyond the 17 corrupted officers they had already identified, Paul admitted that DEA did not know for certain, but suspected it was more extensive than what had been uncovered so far. The cartel had proven willing to invest significant resources in corrupting law enforcement, and TSA officers were attractive targets because they were relatively low-paid, faced financial stress, and had direct access to the screening process. The meeting concluded with an agreement for expanded coordination. DEA would share intelligence on known cartel operatives who might be involved in recruiting TSA officers. Customs and Border Protection would enhance screening procedures for travelers on flights originating from known drug source countries. The Department of Homeland Security would implement immediate reforms to TSA hiring and supervision practices, and the FBI would continue leading the criminal investigation, while also conducting a comprehensive audit of TSA personnel nationwide. Monica returned to her office after the meeting and found Carmen waiting with urgent news from Denver. FBI agents conducting follow-up searches of Victor Ruiz's properties had found a laptop hidden in his garage that contained extensive files related to the airport corruption operation. The laptop had communications with corrupt officers at airports that had not yet been identified in the investigation. The encrypted files were being analyzed by the FBI's cyber division but preliminary review suggested the operation might involve as many as 40 TSA officers at 23 different airports. The scale of the conspiracy was stunning. This was not a few bad officers taking bribes. This was a systematic infiltration of airport security by a criminal organization that had identified and exploited institutional weaknesses. Monica immediately expanded Operation Clean Passage, authorizing additional resources and personnel. She wanted every corrupt officer identified and arrested before they could plant evidence on anyone else. The cyber division worked around the clock to decrypt the files from Victor's laptop. What they found was a detailed manual for recruiting and managing corrupted TSA officers. The manual included profiles of ideal targets, officers with gambling problems, medical debt, mortgages they could not afford, or other financial pressures. It provided scripts for initial approaches, instructions for vetting potential recruits to ensure they were not undercover investigators, and detailed procedures for maintaining operational security. The manual also included performance metrics. The cartel tracked how many successful plants each corrupted officer achieved, how much security disruption each arrest created, and how many real shipments passed through while security was distracted. Officers who performed well received bonuses. Officers who made mistakes or drew suspicion were cut loose. It was run like a business, with Victor Ruiz serving as a middle manager between the cartel leadership and the corrupt officers. Monica briefed the Attorney General on the new findings. The investigation was now clearly a matter of national security. A foreign criminal organization had successfully compromised airport security at nearly 24 major airports. The immediate priority had to be identifying and removing every corrupted officer before the cartel could warn them or help them flee. The Attorney General agreed and authorized whatever resources were necessary. The FBI conducted simultaneous operations at 23 airports over a 48-hour period. Undercover agents posed as travelers while surveillance teams watched suspected corrupt officers. In several cases, the agents observed the officers receiving text messages and then immediately calling travelers over for secondary screening. The patterns matched exactly what Kyle Murphy had been doing in Denver. As soon as the surveillance teams had sufficient evidence, arrest teams moved in. By the end of the 48 hours, the FBI had arrested 42 TSA officers, 11 cartel operatives who had been serving as recruiters and handlers like Victor Ruiz, and dozens of lower-level members of the trafficking organization. The arrests made headlines across the country. Major news networks ran stories about the massive corruption scandal. Congress announced immediate hearings. The administrator of TSA resigned under pressure. Monica held a press conference at FBI headquarters to explain the operation. She stood at a podium with the FBI seal behind her and spoke clearly into the cameras. She described how the investigation had begun with one corrupt officer planting evidence on a traveler in Denver, and how that single incident had unraveled a conspiracy involving dozens of officers and a major drug trafficking organization. She emphasized that hundreds of innocent people had been falsely accused and that the FBI was working to exonerate every one of them. A reporter asked Monica whether her personal experience of being targeted had influenced the scope and intensity of the investigation. Monica's answer was direct and honest. Yes, being targeted had given her personal insight into how the corruption operated and how victims experienced it, but the investigation would have been just as thorough regardless of who the victim was. Every person who had been falsely accused deserved justice, whether they were the FBI director or a random traveler with no power or resources. Another reporter asked whether the investigation had identified who had ordered Victor to target Monica specifically. This question had been bothering Monica because Kyle Murphy's selection of her had seemed random. But Victor's text message that morning had included a photo. Had the cartel somehow known she would be at that airport? The FBI's analysis suggested no. It had been terrible luck for Kyle and Victor. The photo Victor sent had shown a different woman entirely. Kyle had ignored the photo and selected Monica based on his own profiling. It was pure coincidence that he had chosen the one person with the authority and resources to unravel the entire conspiracy. The press conference lasted an hour. Monica answered questions about the investigation, the reforms being implemented, and the process for exonerating victims. She refused to comment on specific legal proceedings against the arrested officers because those cases were now with prosecutors. But she made clear that the FBI viewed this as one of the most serious corruption cases in recent history and would pursue it aggressively. Behind the scenes, the victim identification and exoneration process continued. The FBI had now compiled a list of 473 people who had been arrested by the 42 corrupt TSA officers. Each case required individual review. Some arrests might have been legitimate even though the officer was corrupt. The FBI needed to examine evidence, interview the arrested individuals, review security footage where available, and make determinations about which cases involved planted evidence. Monica assigned 30 agents to work full-time on victim cases. She wanted every person contacted within 2 months and every false conviction overturned within 6 months. This was an unprecedented effort requiring coordination between the FBI, the Department of Justice, federal prosecutors, state courts, and defense attorneys. The legal complexities were enormous because some of the false arrests had resulted in federal convictions while others had been prosecuted at the state level. Carmen was put in charge of the Victim Assistance Program. She established a dedicated phone line and email address. The federal courthouse in Denver was packed on the morning Kyle Murphy's trial began. Media crews lined the sidewalk outside while protesters held signs demanding justice for the victims of TSA corruption. Inside, Monica sat in the gallery among the public, having deliberately chosen not to sit in the reserved section for law enforcement officials. She wanted to experience the trial the way an ordinary citizen would, as a reminder that justice was supposed to serve everyone equally. Kyle had initially planned to plead not guilty, despite the overwhelming evidence against him, but his attorney had convinced him that cooperation was his only hope for a reduced sentence. Kyle agreed to plead guilty to conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. In exchange for his guilty plea and continued cooperation with investigators, prosecutors recommended a sentence of 15 years rather than the maximum of 30 years he faced. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the guilty plea. The prosecutor called several victims to give impact statements. Patricia Santos, the nurse who had lost her license, testified about how the false arrest had destroyed her career and her sense of security. She described nights lying awake, wondering how the drugs had gotten in her bag, doubting her own memory, questioning whether she was losing her mind. She described the humiliation of having to tell her employer why she was being arrested, the fear of going to jail, the desperation of accepting a plea deal even though she was innocent. Kevin Wright, the college student who had been expelled, testified about how his entire future had been derailed. He had been on track to graduate with honors and had job offers from major technology companies. After his arrest, the university expelled him, and the companies withdrew their offers. His scholarships were revoked. His reputation was destroyed. He spent a year working low-wage jobs and living with his parents, watching his former classmates graduate and begin their careers, while he was stuck in limbo. An elderly man named George Baker testified about being arrested while traveling home from visiting his son's grave at Arlington National Cemetery. George was a Vietnam veteran with no criminal record. The false arrest had triggered post-traumatic stress from his military service. He became unable to sleep, started having panic attacks, and withdrew from his community. His wife testified that the man who returned from that trip was not the same man who had left, that something essential had been broken inside him. One after another, the victims testified about the damage Kyle's actions had caused. Some spoke with anger, some with sorrow, some with quiet dignity. Kyle sat at the defense table with his head down, unable to meet their eyes. His attorney had advised him to show remorse, but the depth of the pain his actions had caused seemed to overwhelm him. He began to cry silently as George Baker described his panic attacks. When it was time for Kyle to make a statement before sentencing, he stood and tried to explain what he had done. He talked about the gambling debts and the threats from the people he owed money to. He talked about his fear for his family's safety. He talked about convincing himself that the travelers he targeted would eventually be cleared, and that no permanent harm would result. But as he spoke, he seemed to realize how hollow these explanations sounded in the face of the testimony from people whose lives he had destroyed. Kyle's voice broke as he apologized to each victim by name. He acknowledged that nothing he said could undo the harm he had caused. He said he understood that he deserved to go to prison, and that he hoped his cooperation with investigators would at least prevent other people from being victimized. He turned to look at the victims in the courtroom and said simply that he was sorry. Knowing the words were inadequate but having nothing else to offer, the judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Barbara Collins, listened to all the testimony and statements before pronouncing sentence. She noted that Kyle had abused a position of trust and had systematically violated the rights of innocent people for personal financial gain. She noted that his actions had damaged public confidence in law enforcement and airport security. She also noted his cooperation with investigators and his apparent remorse. She sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. As federal marshals led Kyle from the courtroom, Monica watched the victims' faces. Some looked satisfied that justice had been served. Some looked like the sentence was not enough. Some just looked exhausted, as if the trial had drained whatever energy they had left for anger. Justice, Monica reflected, was complicated. Punishment for the guilty was important, but it did not automatically heal the wounded. Similar scenes played out in courthouses across the country as the other corrupt TSA officers went to trial. Most pleaded guilty and cooperated with prosecutors. A few insisted on trials and were convicted by overwhelming evidence. Sentences ranged from 10 years to 25 years depending on the number of victims and the extent of cooperation. The cartel members received longer sentences, with Victor Ruiz sentenced to 30 years for his leadership role in the conspiracy. While the criminal prosecutions proceeded, the civil process of exonerating victims and providing compensation moved forward. The Department of Justice established a victim compensation fund with $50 million, appropriated by Congress. Each person who could demonstrate they had been falsely accused received compensation based on the severity of harm they suffered. People who went to prison received larger amounts than those whose charges were dismissed quickly. People who lost professional licenses or jobs received compensation for lost income. People who suffered health consequences received payment for medical expenses. Monica insisted on a transparent process for determining compensation amounts. An independent board of retired judges and victim advocates reviewed each case and made determinations based on clear criteria. She did not want the process to become political or to favor certain victims over others. Everyone who had been harmed deserved fair treatment, regardless of their background or their ability to hire lawyers. Carmen led the FBI team working with victims to help them navigate the compensation process and access social services. Many victims needed help beyond money. Some needed counseling to deal with trauma. Some needed assistance restoring professional licenses. Some needed help finding employment after having criminal records. The FBI connected victims with nonprofit organizations, pro bono legal services, and government programs that could help with their specific needs. Linda Yang had become something of a hero in the aftermath of the scandal. Her willingness to speak up about her concerns regarding Kyle Murphy had been crucial to the investigation. The FBI offered her a position as a training instructor at the academy in Quantico, teaching new agents how to recognize and report corruption. Linda accepted the position and moved to Virginia. She found the work meaningful and took pride in knowing that she was helping prevent future abuses. Alan Price, the TSA supervisor at Denver International who had taken quick action when the incident with Monica occurred, was promoted to a regional leadership position overseeing security operations at multiple airports. He was tasked with implementing the reforms that had emerged from the investigation. Alan took the responsibility seriously, knowing that the public's trust in airport security had been severely damaged and would take years to restore. The reforms themselves were comprehensive and sometimes controversial. TSA officers received significant pay increases to reduce financial vulnerabilities that made them targets for corruption. The hiring process was overhauled to include more thorough background checks and psychological screening. Officers were required to file annual financial disclosure statements, and any unexplained increases in wealth triggered investigations. Partners were rotated regularly to prevent corrupt relationships from forming. Anonymous hotlines were established for officers to report concerns about their colleagues without fear of retaliation. Perhaps most significantly, a new independent oversight board was created to investigate complaints about TSA conduct. The board had the authority to review cases, interview officers and travelers, and recommend disciplinary action. It operated independently from TSA management, reporting directly to Congress. Civil liberties organizations praised the reform as long overdue, while some TSA officers complained that they were being treated as potential criminals. Monica testified before Congress about the investigation and the reforms. She appeared before both the Senate and House committees responsible for Homeland Security. Her testimony was detailed and frank. She described how the corruption had operated, how many victims had been harmed, and what needed to change to prevent similar abuses in the future. She did not minimize the FBI's own failures in not detecting the pattern earlier. She acknowledged that law enforcement had to do better at protecting innocent people from corrupt officers. Congressional representatives from both parties praised Monica's handling of the investigation and her commitment to reform. But there were also uncomfortable questions. Some representatives wanted to know whether racial profiling had played a role in how Kyle Murphy and the other corrupt officers selected their victims. 18 months had passed since that Tuesday morning when Kyle Murphy made the worst decision of his life. Monica stood at the podium of the International Law Enforcement Conference in Washington, addressing an audience of police chiefs, federal agents, and security officials from around the world. The case that had begun with one corrupt TSA officer had become a landmark example of how to investigate systemic corruption and implement meaningful reform. Monica's speech was titled, "Accountability and Reform, Lessons from Operation Clean Passage." She walked the audience through the entire investigation, from her personal experience of being targeted to the final arrests and convictions, but she focused most of her attention on the lessons learned and the changes that had resulted. She emphasized that corruption thrived in environments where oversight was weak, where officers faced financial pressures without support, and where victims had no effective means to challenge abuse of authority. The reforms implemented after Operation Clean Passage had become a model that other agencies were studying and adapting. The TSA changes had been the most visible. Better pay and benefits, enhanced screening of personnel, mandatory financial disclosures, anonymous reporting systems, and independent oversight. But the principles behind those reforms applied equally to other law enforcement agencies. Any organization that gave individuals power over others needed robust systems to prevent and detect abuse of that power. Monica described the victim compensation program and the exoneration process in detail. 473 people had been falsely accused by corrupt TSA officers. Of those, 412 had been fully exonerated after investigation confirmed they were victims of planted evidence. The remaining 61 cases were still under review or involved people who could not be located for follow-up. Every exonerated person had received compensation, formal apologies, and assistance with record expungement and license restoration. The financial cost of the compensation program had been significant, totaling over $60 million. Some critics had complained about the expense, arguing that taxpayers should not have to pay for the actions of corrupt individuals. Monica's response was unequivocal. When government officials abused their authority and harmed innocent people, the government had a moral and legal obligation to make things right. The cost of compensation was far less than the cost of allowing corruption to continue unchecked. She also discussed the less tangible impacts. Public trust in airport security had been damaged by the scandal, but was gradually being restored through transparency and visible reforms. TSA officers reported feeling more supported by better pay and training, though some resented the increased oversight. Travelers were more aware of their rights when dealing with security personnel, and law enforcement agencies across the country had begun examining their own systems for vulnerabilities similar to those that had enabled the TSA corruption. After her speech, Monica participated in a panel discussion with other law enforcement leaders about preventing corruption. A police chief from Chicago asked how to balance trust in officers with necessary oversight. Monica acknowledged this was difficult, but argued that good officers should welcome accountability systems because those systems protected them from false accusations just as they protected the public from bad officers. Trust and verification were not opposites. They were complementary. A customs official from Canada asked about the international cooperation aspects of the investigation. Monica praised the work of Mexican and Colombian authorities in arresting cartel members, but she also acknowledged that international coordination remained challenging. Different legal systems, different priorities, and diplomatic complications often slowed investigations. The drug trafficking organization damaged by Operation Clean Passage was still operational, though much weakened. The fight against international crime required sustained cooperation over years, not just one successful operation. Later that day, Monica met privately with a group of victim advocates and civil rights attorneys who had been monitoring the case. They had praise for how the FBI handled the victim compensation process, but also had criticisms and suggestions for improvement. Some victims were still struggling with trauma and needed more mental health support than had been provided. Some had difficulty accessing the compensation funds due to bureaucratic obstacles. Some felt the independent oversight board created to watch TSA needed more authority and resources. Monica listened carefully and took notes. She had learned during the investigation that accepting criticism and learning from mistakes was essential to improvement. The victim advocates had valid points. The system was better than before, but still not perfect. She promised to work with Congress on additional funding for victim services and to push for stronger powers for the oversight board. Change was an ongoing process, not a one-time achievement. Kevin Wright had been invited to speak at the conference about his experience as a victim of corruption. Now 23 years old and back in college, Kevin had become an articulate advocate for criminal justice reform. He told his story to the audience of law enforcement officials with remarkable composure, describing the arrest, the legal nightmare, the year of lost opportunities, and finally the exoneration. He emphasized that he did not hate police or security officers, but he believed the system needed better safeguards to protect innocent people. Kevin's speech received a standing ovation. Several officers approached him afterward to apologize for what he had endured and to promise they would work to prevent similar abuses. Kevin appreciated their sincerity, but also reminded them that good intentions were not enough. Systems needed to be designed so that corruption was difficult, detection was likely, and consequences were severe. Individual integrity was important, but institutional accountability was essential. Monica watched Kevin interact with the law enforcement officials and felt proud of how he had channeled his painful experience into productive advocacy. He could have become bitter and angry, turning away from the system entirely. Instead, he had engaged with it, pushing for reforms while acknowledging the necessary role of law enforcement. That kind of constructive criticism was invaluable for improvement. The FBI Academy at Quantico had incorporated the Operation Clean Passage case into its training curriculum. New agents studied the investigation techniques, the victim assistance protocols, and the reform recommendations. Linda Yang, now an instructor at the Academy, taught classes on recognizing and reporting corruption. She used her experience with Kyle Murphy as a case study, describing the warning signs she had noticed but initially dismissed. She emphasized to new agents that loyalty to fellow officers should never override responsibility to the public and to justice. Patricia Santos had also become involved in reform efforts. She joined an organization that provided support to people who had been wrongly convicted or falsely accused. She used her nursing background to help address the health impacts of wrongful prosecution, which often included anxiety, depression, and stress-related physical ailments. Patricia found meaning in helping others who had experienced similar trauma, turning her own painful experience into service to fellow victims. The academic community had taken interest in the case as well. Researchers at several universities studied the Operation Clean Passage investigation to understand how corruption networks form and how they can be detected. Criminology journals published articles analyzing the recruitment methods the cartel used to identify vulnerable TSA officers. Psychology journals examined the trauma experienced by victims of planted evidence. Public administration journals studied the reform process and its effectiveness. Monica was invited to speak at a law school about the legal and ethical issues raised by the case. She discussed the difficult balance between giving law enforcement necessary authority and preventing abuse of that authority. She talked about the danger of profiling and how it created vulnerabilities that criminals could exploit. She emphasized that the rule of law meant nothing if it was not applied equally regardless of race or economic status. The law students asked thoughtful questions about qualified immunity, evidence standards, and reform implementation. One student asked whether Monica thought the reforms would last or whether they would gradually erode over time as memory of the scandal faded. Monica's answer was realistic. Yes, there was always a risk that reforms would be weakened by budget pressures, bureaucratic resistance, or simple complacency. Maintaining accountability required constant vigilance. That was why independent oversight, whistleblower protections, and public transparency were so important. The moment people stopped paying attention was the moment corruption could take root again. The International Drug Trafficking Organization had been significantly damaged but not destroyed. Several key leaders had been arrested and imprisoned. Major assets had been seized. The airport corruption network had been dismantled. But organized crime was resilient. The cartel had adapted to the losses, developed new smuggling routes, and begun rebuilding. DEA continued to track the organization and coordinate with international partners to disrupt their operations. The fight against drug trafficking was ongoing, measured in decades rather than years. The secure office where Monica waited was small and windowless, with plain white walls and basic furniture that had seen better days. She sat at a metal desk and continued working through her phone, making calls and sending encrypted messages to key personnel across the country. Even in the middle of being falsely arrested, she remained focused on the larger implications of what had just occurred. If one TSA officer was corrupt enough to plant evidence, the problem was almost certainly not isolated to Denver or to one individual. 23 minutes after her initial call, 3 FBI agents arrived at the airport. They were led by Special Agent Carmen Rodriguez, the head of the Denver field office. Carmen was 45 years old with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. She had worked with Monica years ago when they were both junior agents investigating a bank fraud case in Chicago. Carmen had enormous respect for Monica's abilities and was absolutely horrified that this incident had happened in her jurisdiction. Carmen entered the office and immediately apologized, but Monica waved the apology away with an impatient gesture. There was no time for that, and it was not Carmen's fault. Monica quickly briefed her on exactly what had happened, describing every detail from the moment Kyle had called her over to the moment she had seen him plant the package in her bag. Carmen listened with growing anger, taking notes on her tablet. When Monica finished, Carmen assured her that every resource of the Denver field office was now dedicated to investigating this incident. Monica stood and straightened her sweater. She wanted to review the security camera footage immediately. Alan Price had already secured the recordings and had them ready in the airport security control room. The group moved through the terminal with purpose, drawing curious stares from travelers who wondered why so many serious-looking federal agents were suddenly present. The security control room was lined with monitors showing feeds from hundreds of cameras throughout the airport. A young technician named Danny Carter operated the playback system, queuing up the relevant footage from Terminal B. Monica, Carmen, Alan, and 2 other FBI agents crowded around the main monitor to watch. Danny played the sequence starting from when Monica first approached the checkpoint. The footage was damning in its clarity. The cameras captured Kyle calling Monica over from multiple angles. They showed him opening her bag and beginning the search. Then, in perfect high-definition detail, the cameras recorded Kyle's right hand dipping into his pocket, emerging with a small package, and slipping that package into the side pocket of Monica's carry-on bag. His movements were smooth and practiced, the actions of someone who had done this many times before. Less than 3 seconds after planting the package, his hand reached into the same pocket and pulled it out again while his face registered fake surprise. Carmen watched the footage 3 times, her jaw tightening with each viewing. This was not a questionable case where reasonable people might disagree about what had happened. This was clear, unambiguous criminal activity captured in perfect detail. She turned to Alan and asked how many arrests Kyle Murphy had made in the past year. Alan pulled up the records on a computer terminal. Kyle had made 47 arrests, which was significantly higher than the average for TSA officers at Denver International. Most of those arrests were for drug possession. Monica's investigative instincts were working at full speed now. 47 arrests in 1 year for an airport security officer was suspicious. TSA officers were not supposed to be making that many arrests. Their job was screening, not active law enforcement. The high number suggested either remarkable luck or something much darker. She asked Carmen to pull Kyle's financial records immediately. Carmen made a call to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and put a rush on the request. While they waited for the financial information, Monica wanted to interview Kyle herself. Carmen looked uncertain about this. Standard protocol would be to keep the victim separate from the suspect during the initial investigation. But Monica was not just the victim, she was also the director of the FBI. And this was now a federal investigation into corruption of a security officer at a major airport. Carmen nodded and arranged for Kyle to be brought to an interview room. Kyle was escorted into the interview room by 2 FBI agents. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. The confidence he had displayed during the arrest was completely gone, replaced by the hollow expression of someone who knew their life was falling apart. He sat down at the table across from Monica and Carmen without making eye contact. Monica studied him in silence for a long moment. She had interviewed hundreds of suspects over her career and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people. Kyle was terrified, but there was something else beneath the terror. Resignation, maybe, or relief that it was finally over. She began with a simple question. How long had he been planting evidence on travelers? Kyle's first instinct was to deny everything. He started to claim that the drugs had really been in Monica's bag, that this was all a misunderstanding, that the camera footage must have been manipulated somehow. But the lies died in his throat before he could fully speak them. He looked at Monica's face and saw no sympathy there, no possibility of mercy for continued deception. He looked at Carmen's face and saw professional disgust. He thought about the security footage they had just watched and knew there was no point in lying anymore. The whole story came out in a rush. Kyle told them about the gambling debts and Victor's approach. He described the system. Wait for a text message, select a target, plant a package during secondary screening, make the arrest. $5,000 per successful plant. He had done it 17 times over the past 18 months. The arrests created chaos and tied up security resources, allowing Victor's people to move real shipments through other checkpoints while everyone was distracted. Monica listened without interrupting. When Kyle finished, she asked about the other people involved. Kyle insisted he only knew Victor, and Victor had never given him a last name or any information about the larger organization. They communicated exclusively through burner phones. The money appeared in his bank account from what looked like legitimate sources, different companies each time. He had never met anyone else involved in the operation. Carmen was taking detailed notes and recording the interview. She asked Kyle if he had any way to contact Victor. Kyle pulled out his personal phone and showed them the number he used to receive the text messages. Carmen immediately handed the phone to one of the other agents with instructions to get the technical team working on tracing it. She suspected it would lead to another burner phone, but they had to try every avenue. Monica asked the harder question. Did Kyle understand that he had destroyed innocent people's lives? Each person he had framed faced arrest, legal fees, possible jail time, loss of employment, damage to their reputations. Some of them might have lost custody of their children or been deported or had their entire futures derailed because of his actions. Did he think about that? Kyle broke down. Tears ran down his face as he tried to explain that he had been desperate and scared and had not known what else to do. The people Victor worked for had threatened his family. He had convinced himself that the travelers he targeted could afford good lawyers and would eventually be cleared. He knew those were just excuses he had told himself to sleep at night. He knew what he had done was unforgivable. Monica felt no sympathy. She had seen too many criminals try to justify their actions with sob stories about desperation and family. The truth was that Kyle had made choices, and those choices had harmed innocent people while enriching himself. The fact that he felt bad about it now did not undo the damage. She stood and informed Kyle that he would be charged with multiple federal crimes, including conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, deprivation of rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. She recommended he contact a lawyer immediately. Carmen remained in the interview room to complete the formal arrest procedures while Monica stepped outside. Her phone was already ringing with calls from Washington. Her deputy director wanted updates. The attorney general wanted to know if she was safe and whether this represented a broader security threat. The media had somehow gotten wind that something significant was happening at Denver International, and reporters were starting to gather outside the terminal. Monica made a decision. This case was going to be investigated thoroughly and properly. She was going to use every resource available to the FBI to identify everyone involved in this operation. and she was personally going to make sure that every single person Kyle Murphy had falsely accused received justice. This had started as an attempt to frame one random traveler, but it was going to end with the exposure of what she suspected was a much larger conspiracy. Alan Price approached her with additional information. His security team had been reviewing Kyle's work history and had identified patterns. Kyle's arrests clustered around specific times and days that matched known drug trafficking routes. Several of the travelers Kyle had arrested had protested their innocence loudly and consistently, but their cases had moved forward anyway because the physical evidence seemed clear.